limited capacity, but so guys, that's only so that we can play this back later or put it on our YouTube channel in the event that there becomes a need. So please know that you are being recorded, and you can turn off your video if you're interested. But I think most of us are probably multitasking. So let's dive in, because there are a number of issues to cover tonight. What you see on your screen is sort of a guideline, just some background. Tonight, we're going to talk about the issue and the litigation that's currently in process and how you can help. We've got time for questions and discussion. Most of the images that you see on this screen are things that you're familiar with. These pop all over our social media all the time. They are companies and people who use the horses in some capacity to market their goods or services. And so I don't want to dwell or spend time on there, but wanted to give a little bit of visual context for some of our discussion. Everybody on this call tonight, I think, is familiar with some of this language, but I think it's important to contextualize as we consider any issue as it relates to the seashore and wilderness. And that is its originating legislation from 1972. So if you're not familiar with that language, I wanted to be sure and put it here. To sort of contextualize all of the discussion that we are having. This is understandably a very contentious issue, and one that people feel very strongly about one way or another. And I think it's important to sort of center ourselves on the purpose of the seashore and what was intended for its purpose. Again, just to reiterate, it was originally established to provide for public outdoor recreation use and enjoyment of certain significant shoreline lands and waters of the United States. So the seashore specifically is supposed to be preserved permanently in its primitive state, and no development of the project or plan for the convenience of visitors is supposed to be undertaken that would be incompatible with the preservation of the flora and fauna that were occurring on the island at the time that the seashore was established. So I think it's helpful to contextualize. Most of you are also familiar with this map. This is something we refer to frequently within the work that we do. What you see in green is the designated official wilderness on Cumberland Island. The yellow is potential wilderness that has not yet converted in any way to official wilderness. But we understand the significance of our largest and southernmost barrier island. So, for our state, it provides a great deal of protection from flooding and storm surge and hurricane damage, but it also is one of the most ecologically diverse barrier islands. And it's also only one of 10 national seashores in the United States. So what you see there is reflected in both green and yellow, 20,000 acres, designated as both wilderness and potential wilderness in 1982. Our island was part of a region in the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve previously that was established, I think, in 84. That has been removed, but it's also a landscape of hemispheric importance for the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. So we can talk a lot about the hundreds of species that rely on Cumberland Island for various functions, but it's also important to sort of center ourselves in this poor graphic. But it is part of an infographic series that we did earlier in the year, and it talks a little about the history of the horses on Cumberland Island. So in the event you haven't seen this, I thought, also helpful to contextualize this discussion, to understand that in the 1880s, horses were brought for use on the island, and new stock continued to be introduced. Horses were taken off island for sale. There was a lot of transaction going on among the horse population. But both horses and cattle were managed as free-ranging livestock at that time. And until the 40s and the 60s, that was commonplace. It wasn't until 1972 that the seashore was established and horses and cattle were both feral, roaming the island. But in the 80s, those feral cattle were rounded up and removed from the island. The horses remained and have been a tourist attraction ever since. It's certainly a draw for many visitors. So in 1997, a special rider was attached to a bill that prevented the Park Service from removing, managing, doing anything with the horses, and that did expire. So here we are, fast forward 2023. And that is why we are having the discussion we are having tonight. So I hope that my summary is helpful to those of you who've not been able to follow this issue very closely, and Hal Wright, one of the attorneys, will get into sort of the folks involved in this litigation as we go on, is joining us by audio, and he is free to interrupt me at any time if I have misspoken or misrepresented anything about this issue. I am neither an attorney nor a scientist. I am an advocate, and I care a lot about a place. So what I want to do tonight is try and summarize for you what has happened, when it happened, where it's happening, and we'll walk through some of that. So this document and several other documents are on our website at wildcumberland.org in the event that you want to refer specifically to the original content. But this lawsuit that we're here to discuss was filed in April of this year, this calendar year, 2023. It was filed in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia, Northern Division. If you're legal, that matters a lot. For the average person, that may not be something that you would have wanted to know, but it's relevant, and there are a lot of reasons that's relevant. So this lawsuit was filed and requested that the Park Service or the state of Georgia take responsibility for the feral horse population on Cumberland Island, and suggested that the agency should prevent horses from being able to infiltrate or be a part of the wilderness and potential wilderness on Cumberland Island. So that is the premise of the suit in its most basic form. And Hal is going to have lots to add as we go on. But that is sort of the premise of this, and is some timeline as to what has happened. Who is involved? Here, I provided a very succinct list for you so that you can see the plaintiffs and defendants listed in this litigation. The plaintiffs are listed as the horses on Cumberland Island, the Georgia Equine Rescue League, the Georgia Horse Council, Will Harlan, who is the Southeast Director for the Center for Biological Diversity, and Carol Ruckteschel, who is a Cumberland resident and, of course, a founding member of this organization, and very much an inspiration for the work that we do. The attorneys on this litigation are Hal Wright, who is with us tonight, and the DuBose Law Group. And the defendants are many. So you've got Deb Holland at the DOI, Department of Interior. You've got Mark Faust at the National Park Service, Department of Interior. You have the former Superintendent Gary Ingram at the Seashore Park Service, Department of Interior. You have the Commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources, who is now Walter Rabon. I never know if I'm saying his name correctly or not. Rabon, I don't know. I'm too Southern for that. And then Tyler Harper, who is serving as the commissioner for the Georgia Department of Agriculture. So there are lots of parties to try and keep straight. And as a result, there are multiple pieces to this litigation. So I think it's helpful to sort of see it listed out for everybody who may not have been following along. Why has this litigation happened? Has been a question that I've been asked a lot. And to pull directly from the documents that have been filed, the argument here is that this group is working to advance the health and well-being of the horses on Cumberland Island and to protect the island's natural and wilderness resources. So in this suit, there are allegations that the Park Service has caused harm both to the horses and the natural resources of the seashore, and that there are violations of things, including the National Park Service's Organic Act, the Wilderness Act, and the Endangered Species Act, which all of us on this call, I think, are probably familiar with most of those policies and laws. Where are we? This is where I get to turn it over to Hal a little bit and let him speak. more about the details that have happened since that litigation was filed in April of this year. But what I can tell you is that all of those defendants, the federal and the state defendants listed previously, I'll go back just here. So that entire list of defendants there um, has essentially moved for the case to be dismissed. And that has been, there's a different reason for everyone. And um, there are arguments on every capacity about lack of responsibility, suggesting they're not actually required to take action, or that the horses may not have standing. There are a number of nuances to that, but at this point, we are really waiting for the court to rule on all of those motions to dismiss the allegations that have been brought forward. So I'm going to finally stop talking and catch my breath and maybe even make sure my kids are in bed. But I want to turn it over to Hal. There is a little bit of a delay coming from Cumberland Island, and see if, based on my summary, there's anything that Hal, Mr. Wright, would like to add to that or elaborate on for this group tonight. So I'm going to mute myself, and Hal, please.
Thank you, Jess. You did a great job presenting that and summarizing it. It's really not a whole lot for me to add, believe it or not. As I'm sure you've heard very, very often, it's pending litigation, which means it's really better than not that I don't say a whole lot about really the details of the lawsuit, and really, trying to put the law with the facts, or the facts to the law. It's just not a smart thing to do, despite what you see on the news every day. It's so, I'm not really going to go into any really great details about what the arguments may or may not be on the plaintiff side or the defendant side, other than to say that, pretty much the case has gone as we probably would have expected. There's really no surprises. Typically in a case like this, the defendants come out and challenge in a motion to dismiss, like has been filed, all of the plaintiff standing, the jurisdiction of the court, basically everything that they can challenge at the initial stage of here. So, and we'll see. We'll see what comes out on the from the forward from there. So, to get a little bit more detail on exactly what was alleged. So there were 7 counts in the initial complaint. Primarily, most of them dealt with or were directed towards the Park Service, and Jessica, dealt with that. But and I'm just gonna very, very briefly highlight those just so you'll have a little bit of context for people that aren't familiar with that. So the count 1 really addressed the Organic Act of the park, and which basically there's an obligation on the part of the Park Service, not that the horses are doing, or at least we're alleging that the horses are doing just that. Count 2 addressed the Cumberland Island National Seashore enabling legislation itself, which is very similar to the overarching organic legislation. It's worded differently, but it's basically the same, which is, the whole horse got to be preserved in its primitive state. The horses are not doing that in effect, and that led to a debate, if you will, as to who owns the horses and who are in control of the horses. And so that that was part and parcel of the briefing in the lawsuit. The third count addressed the Wilderness Act. Same basic argument that basically horses as livestock are contrary to the whole intent and purpose of the Wilderness Act. And basically having livestock running at large through a wilderness is completely contrary. The fourth count addressed the Endangered Species Act. And specifically, there were two endangered or protected species, the loggerhead sea turtle and the piping plover. It went into detail as to why there again, the sort of the running at large of these horses across the island threatened both of those species. Count 5 went started going into the state. Count 5 specifically addressed Humane Care for Equines Act, which is a state law that requires persons that own or have custody or control over any equine in the state must do so in a humane fashion. They're required to provide adequate food, water, and humane care. And arguably, this addresses the overall humane care of horses on the island. That was count 5. Count 6 is focused on a state law that prohibits running livestock at large, and arguably that's what's occurring on Cumberland Island. And then finally, count 7 was a count that was not well. It was a conglomeration. It was basically casting the state as the trustee of the state's resources as embodied in the Marshland Protection Act, the Shoreline Protection Act, the SEAD Act, and the Georgia Coastal Zone Management Act. And that particular count was premised on the state of Georgia having control over and jurisdiction over the federal horses. And then number 2, that as the public trustee of the island's natural and as trustee that the state was charged with not impairing those particular resources for the benefit of that particular count was interesting in the way it was received by the state of Georgia. So I won't go into any details as to really how they received that and what their defenses were, but as a citizen of Georgia, I was really sort of amazed at what their position was on that. So then, sort of to sum all that up, and what's sort of important, I think, to understand is the relief that the plaintiffs are seeking here, and so. And this is getting down sort of into the legal weeds a little bit, but the plaintiffs are not seeking to do necessarily to do away with the horses or to I guess remove the horses forthwith. That's not specifically what the plaintiffs are trying to do or seek. They're immediately what they're trying to do is just simply ask the court to acknowledge that the running as there what's happening right now, the running at large of these horses across the entirety of Cumberland Island and the seashore is basically illegal. That it's not permitted under either state or federal law, and that it is also humane or inhumane, excuse me, in this not a way for these horses to continue to live and to try to exist, and it should cease. And so, we're not really trying to focus on how that's to be addressed specifically, but that it needs to stop. So the how of this really is to be determined in the future. And I guess I should say at this point too that on two previous occasions, roughly I'd say 4.5 months apart, prior to initiating this litigation, we sent two letters to all the defendants, basically notifying them that what our concerns were, and then also offering to help participate not only in coming up with a viable solution for the horses, but also with viable resources to assist with implementing those solutions. And we got not one response from any of the defendants. And they basically just said, basically sue us. So that's why one reason why we're here is that they just basically took a position of you're going to have to take us to court to get anything done. So I think with that, I think probably one of the most productive things to do probably is just to open it up for questions, but I'm going to turn it back over to Jess at this point.
I think that context, though,
If
was
she's
really
there.
helpful. Yeah, there's a little bit of a delay, and you may have had a little difficulty hearing part of what Hal had to say, but I think that the gist of it came through certainly on my end, and I think that contextual information and detail is really helpful as we discuss the nuances of this particular situation. So thank you for taking the time to share all of that. I think that that was great. How I really appreciate it. I'm gonna pause just for a second to sort of say that there are lots of other parks where the National Park Service is working to protect endangered species or remove um, non-native or invasive species. And you see a short list of them here. Certainly, the one of those that rings probably truest to this group is the last on this list, which is the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Um, and I think it's important to mention to this group because while some of these parks on this list may be managing too many elk or feral hogs or non native vegetation, what's happening at Theodore Roosevelt National Park is specific to feral horses. That park has actually initiated, it's been an NPS led initiative um, to implement a livestock management plan that um, evaluates the role of various livestock, including feral horses, in the native ecology of that park. So um, I think in that instance, you see a very different approach where conservation of native species and the natural ecosystem functions seem to be the purpose and intent behind the plan. Um, so I want to just contextualize again. I think it's important to do as we talk about issues that pertain to the seashore, that this is not new to the Park Service. There are other units that are managing the complexity of these issues in a very different way. And for those of you who are very invested in this issue, Theodore Roosevelt National Park is still accepting public comments for its livestock management plan. And Tulsi, I think we have that link buried somewhere if you want to drop it into chat if it's convenient. For folks who feel strongly about this issue, it's a great opportunity to make your voice heard. Um, Again, that park, capture and removal of feral livestock is a regular practice, but um, it seems to be that this from my perspective and our organization's perspective, a very thoughtful approach to um, both the ecology and the history of the park in that plan. So we would encourage you to consider submitting comments if you feel strongly about it. Our organization will certainly be doing so. Yeah, who's that? What we got?
Jessica,
How did?
uh, Jessica, I might add that even within Cumberland Island National Seashore, they directly recognize the need to control livestock. They've implemented, obviously, in the past they removed the cattle without thinking twice about taking the cattle off the seashore. And obviously, they have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and continue to do so to remove feral hogs. And so to single out horses as livestock for different treatment is is really beyond. They can give no reason for doing so, and there's no policy that justifies it. And in fact, it's a complete dereliction of their duties to protect the park's resources. So it's really it's beyond it's completely beyond uh, uh, their own rules and regulations and their own duties under every law that's been brought up in the litigation to do something to manage these horses, not only for the well-being of the resources of the park, but for the horses' own well-being. And so this has been going on for, like I said, for decades. So it's just really inexcusable.
Thanks, Hal, for that context. Yeah, I think it is important to note that. I mean, I think it was just this calendar year that the seashore was approved for, I think it was almost $800,000, so close to $1 million specifically for its predation control program related to hogs. So I think that's really important to consider as we talk about these things. So thanks. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion and questions, even among the small group that we have. So um, I'm just going to move us along and so we can get to that place and say that there are still ways that you can help. Um, Even though this is tied up in litigation and very much lies in the outcome of our court system, I think that it's still important to send a message to the Park Service that there are people who care about the outcome of this issue. I think it's equally important to consider those old school letter to the editors and um, sharing on social media if and where you feel appropriate. Related to your position, but letting our elected officials know, your elected officials know, wherever you are, that the horses are not the primary or only reason that you visit Cumberland Island, I think is also a very important message to communicate. And so while we may feel that we're sort of our hands are tied or this is out of our control as members of the public, I think that there are still ways that we can take action and potentially impact, the outcome of this circumstance. So I know that as I can share and I don't want to overshare, certainly. I know we're tight on time, but when I began visiting the seashore over 30 years ago, I thought the horses were beautiful. I photographed them. I longed to see them. I would be excited when one would cross my path, but um, over time, and the more that I have understood about the island's ecology and the impact that these animals have on it, I have changed my position. And I think many of the people in this group probably have had a similar experience. So, um, I want to be candid that I too began as a romanticized visitor to the island who was, lured by the magic of the maritime forest and its feral horse population. And there is definitely a place to acknowledge and respect the learning process that many people have to go through to understand the complexity of this litigation and the issue as it relates to our public lands. So, with that being said, I want to be quiet. I have talked entirely too much tonight, and I think there may be some questions, there may not, but I want to make sure that I'm offering up an opportunity for anybody in this group to have their questions addressed as much as we can possibly do. So, um, I don't know if there has been anything dropped in chat. I know I received a few questions prior to this session from folks who may not have been able to attend, but wanted us to address their concerns, and I'm happy to get to those. But I'm going to be quiet for a minute and just offer up some space in case anybody would like to unmute or drop a question in chat. So um, let me know if anybody's got anything to say. It's a quiet group tonight.
I'd like to say that you guys presented this really well as far as covering all the facts and what we should know about it, and obviously there's a lot to uncover, and you don't want to say too much, but I'm optimistic on how this is going to turn out realistically. So I would just like to give thanks to you, Jess, and you, Hal, and anyone else who's kind of involved with this. You guys did a really great job tonight with presenting it.
Thanks. It's a really complex issue, and I try to
Yeah.
handle it with care. I know that Hal has very much done the same, and his motivation, I feel, is that out of concern for both the animals and the ecology also. So, um, Tulsi, I think let me be quiet. I said I was going to be quiet, but look how I spoke up again. There is a question. I'll go ahead for Hal. Who would you expect to see represent the persons named in the lawsuit? And maybe if you have a minute to drop that, maybe a little bit more, or unmute yourself to elaborate a little bit more about that question. I'm happy to let you converse.
Yeah, the question was, would they all be represented as a group, or would they answer specifically or individually?
You mean the plaintiffs or the defendants?
The defendants, so there are multiple people named, and I'm not sure how this type of litigation works. So would they all be represented by one person, or do they each individually have to answer?
I think, and it may be kind of difficult for us with the lag, but I'm gonna guess that Ken means the defendants. And I think he's looking for clarification on whether or not they each had to respond individually to them, or I guess make a motion to dismiss individually versus being represented as a group. Maybe you can speak to that, how the federal and state agencies responded.
Okay, so I'll deal with the federal defendants are all represented by the broadly by the Department of Justice. And within the Department of Justice, they have different groups. So they have like an environmental practice group.
We might have lost
Then they
Hal's
have
audio.
a,
We have been
then they,
successful
within the
for
environmental
like,
practice
what, 40
group.
minutes? That's pretty record breaking from the island, but we might have lost Hal on his audio. And if that's the case, I think if
We
I'm
can hear him.
interpreting Ken's question correctly, is that those agencies and the federal and state agencies, are they, oh, you have Hal. I don't have Hal. Wait, I'll be quiet then if I'm interrupting Hal, but I can't hear Hal.
You interrupted me.
You can hear me.
Anyway, I'll just continue. So the DOJ has different practice groups within the DOJ, but they all represent all of the federal defendants collectively. So they write one, generally they'll write one federal defendants. So that's how that works. So they represent the Park Service, the Department of Interior, and then each individual within those entities are they're being sued in their individual capacity. So those individuals they're just really representing the agency. So that's how that works on the federal side. On the state side, it's sort of the same thing. You have the Attorney General and his office, and they can choose if there's a conflict, if they think there's a conflict in the Commissioner of Department of Natural Resources somehow, they may assign two separate legal groups to represent each individual, in this case, each individual defendant separately, or they can combine and represent them together. In this case, for some reason, actually, and I'll just tell you this little story. So this shows you how sort of anal attorneys can be in some of the games that happen. So we served through the deputy, the sheriff, the Fulton County Sheriff's Office. We served the Commissioner of Agriculture and the Commissioner of Department of Natural Resources. They're in the same building. I'm sure the same deputy went to both offices. We had a typo on the name of the Commissioner of Agriculture. The attorneys refused service because of the typographical error. I mean, they knew exactly who was being served. They said, "Oh, well, this person is not here. we're refusing service." And so we had to serve it all over again. So it was on two different time tracks about the two different defendants. And so that, so there was 2 weeks difference in briefing schedules just because they refused service and made us serve them all over again. I mean, it was just, but to answer your question, that they ended up the same. They basically submitted the same briefs. But we had to brief at two different times, and almost exactly the same exact briefs as far as the state was concerned. So they were just burning up our hours. And there was like 5 on the state. There were 6 attorneys that signed off on the state pleadings. So anyway, I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Jessica ended up making me host. She was having trouble with the audio for some reason. She couldn't hear anyone. So just letting you guys know. It's about 7:45. If anyone else has any more questions, feel free to type in the chat or ask. If not, we will end a little early for everyone. All right. Well, we should have most people's contact information. So if you have any more questions that you think of later, just reach out to us. We'll probably reach out to other people as well. But we appreciate everyone being a part of this. And thank you, Hal. Thank you, Jess, for all of your knowledge on this and your participation in this. This is going to be huge once we start getting traction and everything like that. So I'm optimistic about it. I can't wait till we start here, and I just appreciate you guys. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Have a good night.